Okay, good evening, and well, thank you for joining us on this summer's evening. I'm Sam, and I'm going to be talking about the impact of the Brexit on students. My main point of focus at the start of this is going to be on the issue of study abroad for UK students, just because it's an issue that I'm becoming quite intimately familiar with, planning to go abroad to Warsaw in September to study at the University of Warsaw. But I also realised that as I was planning this talk, there is a much wider issue here with the impact of Brexit on students. So I'm also going to look at the issue of EU students in the UK, and also actually how the sort of wider impacts of Brexit do end up affecting students specifically. This isn't likely to be an exhaustive list of all the impacts of students, mainly because we'd be here all evening and probably into the best part of the rest of the week, to be honest with you. But when I was sort of thinking about how do I tie all these different things together, and what is the impact of Brexit on students, I think the sort of bottom line is that the overall theme here is a sort of loss of mobility. And I'm saying, what is mobility? Because I think that obviously we've got this sort of physical mobility of like crossing borders between the countries. It's like I cannot get into Poland as easily anymore. But there is also sort of the issue of social mobility and sort of moving between different income groups within society, as well as actually the sort of mobility of ideas, and these are things that I want to get into and uncover sort of throughout the course of this presentation. So to start with the first part of our presentation, it's going to be the impact on UK students studying abroad. I'm mainly going to be using the Polish example here. Again, that's because that is the example I'm most familiar with, and it is worth noting that sort of this is going to vary between every country in the European Union. They all have slightly different immigration systems, but if we were to discuss all those, again, I'll repeat that we'd be here all evening, and I'm sure that we don't want to be. So to sort of start with some personal context about my situation, my course that I'm doing is History, Politics and Economics, which I study at the University College London, or UCL, School of Slavonic and East European Studies, or CEAS as we'll now call it. Where I'm looking to go to is the University of Warsaw via a bilateral exchange agreement between those two universities. Back in the day probably would have been an Erasmus scheme, but sure that we'll get into the fact that we don't have access to that anymore. And something that I want to say right now is that I have decent finances. I can afford to fund this, essentially. I've got my loans, I've got my trust fund, and my parents have a decent enough income. You might think, well, why am I telling you this up front? But I promise you that last point is going to become sort of the most relevant point of this presentation later on. So, to start with the visa, sort of the most obvious direct consequence of Brexit. I think that everyone sort of knows in the EU you have visa-free travel, with very few restrictions on that. Now, if you're staying more than 90 days in a 180-day period in the Schengen area, you have to have a visa. So, just to sort of break down what a Polish visa process looks like, of course you have to submit it in person at the consular and Polish diaspora section of the Embassy of the Republic of Poland in London. So that's the only area you can go to. You have to go into London, and you also have to book that online via their e-consulate system, which, I'll be honest, is a slightly outdated system. It's not the most user-friendly thing in the world. On that, you get an application form which you have to fill out, which is quite extensive. Plus, you have to show your acceptance letter. You have to have already booked your health insurance and show that. You might have to give them flight plan reservations, so you might have to have sort of sorted that out already. You have to have an accommodation booking, which is has to be specifically certain types of agreement. You can't just like book a hotel or something. It has to be like a lease agreement properly and those sort of things. And you have to have proof of financial means, which again, that bit is going to become quite relevant because of how funding processes work for students. A lot of them sort of at the time you need to apply for a visa, might not necessarily have those financial means sort of up front. And on top of all that, you have to pay £112 application fee, which I think we'll see that is cheap later on. And this needs to be done sort of 15 days sooner before departure, or ideally a lot sooner. So sort of, the summary is that this is a lot of paperwork. A lease agreement, my one's 68 pages. And I'll have to print this out and submit it in person, so you can imagine having a lot of those multiple pages. This is quite a big deal. And once you're actually in Poland, you may have to get a residence permit, just because of the length of the year abroad, the in excess of 3 months. This is a sort of another direct consequence of Brexit. When you were in the EU, firstly you had visa-free travel in, and then you just have to sort of notify them that you're intending to stay more than 90 days. Prove sort of much the same things, but a bit more informally, shall we say, than compared to what we have to do as non-members now. But this is really, what this is an added layer of bureaucracy, especially because many of these requirements are overlapping with the visa process, and you have to sort of submit paperwork twice, and of course that can be quite inconvenient for a lot of people. And also, this is the sort of big one, this is the one that has been upsetting me since the day I decided to go and study for a year abroad. It's the Turing scheme. I've sort of listed my sort of main gripes with it, is that there's uncertainty, there's inconsistency, and really it's just an inferior scheme to Erasmus in pretty much every way I can conceive of. But just there's a couple of quotes, one from the Yorkshire Bylines about how Erasmus had pre-financing. However, for Turing funding, your placement has to be confirmed before you can access the funding. And in a lot of cases, you don't actually get the funding till your placement has started, which means that there are costs that you have to upfront. So that is like your deposit on your accommodation, travel insurance, all that. And of course, the well-heeled students, which I'm probably including myself in this group, or their parents, may be able to cover this in the short term, but it is out of the question for any from financially deprived backgrounds. And the sort of second point is that applications for funding are made on an annual basis, and this creates a high degree of uncertainty. And it makes it extremely difficult to promote these opportunities to those who rely on funding. So that's the Royal Society of Edinburgh that I found that from. And yeah, I mean, the one thing that we were told by the UCL Study Abroad team up front about the Turing funding was that you're going to have to basically not rely on it. You can't rely on it because they don't know how much Turing funding they're getting until the very last minute. And for a lot of people, especially if your year abroad starts in August, you're already going to be away before you even know if you've got Turing funding, how to access it, etc., on all that. And it's also, what I mean when I say inconsistency is that each university chooses how to allocate its Turing funding. There's no sort of one set system. UCL has decided on its system, which is I'd say it's a reasonably fair system, but it's going to be different from a different university who might decide, well, how are we meant to get this to sort of less well-off people and underrepresented groups like disabled students, etc. And that means that, you know, it's very hard to have a mutual understanding and mutual experience between students from different places, even within the UK. So what does this mean? Is that fundamentally, this has not been prohibitive for me, but it could be for people who are less well off, especially students who have jobs who rely on that part-time job income, probably full-time job now we're sort of on break. That's something that is really, a lot of these finance commitments, a lot of the time commitment for research and actually doing and going through these processes is just going to be, for a lot of students, a non-starter, when perhaps there might have been a group of those students that we could have sent abroad and given these opportunities to, which are great opportunities for your CV and building you for a future career, if we were still part of Erasmus, part of the EU. And also, I think that what's very interesting is that I'd say there's a decreasing amount of support post-Brexit, especially with children. And this is because the people who are there to support you in organising your year abroad placement are also having to navigate these post-Brexit systems. So students aren't familiar with them. The staff really only have sort of 3-4 years of experience compared to several years with familiarity between staff with older systems when we were still a member of the EU. And that means that people who you could normally turn to for support, you might get a lot of I don't know, or it might be that they're still having to research things and responses take longer. And now, this sort of brings us into the second part of our talk. Brexit and international students and international academics is what I want to talk about next. So now I've sort of gone from my experience, I want to say, well, what about people who are from abroad, who want to come over to the UK to either work in academia or to study, and also how that ultimately is going to affect the UK students and really all students within the UK. And we're going to start with the fact that the UK is an expensive country. It has always been an expensive country, to be fair, but it's only gotten more expensive since Brexit. And when I said that the Polish visa seemed reasonably cheap, I think that this is what I mean, is that the visa costs in the UK are going to be of minimum £127. That's if your course is less than 6 months over here. But usually £524 for a student visa in the UK. Plus, you have to pay an immigration health surcharge to access our healthcare facilities, and that's mandatory. £776 per year. And you know, prior to Brexit, neither of these costs were applicable to EU students studying in the UK. But now they are, on top of the fact that the fees for these EU students have more tripled to gone 5 times, I'd say, because they're now paying international fees and not home fees. Again, high cost of living. But also on the workers' side of it, and for academics, initial immigration expenses for foreign workers in the UK have increased by as much as 126% since 2019. So about 1 year before we actually left, which is, I'd say, quite a shocking percentage and definitely enough to be off-putting for some of these academics. And also, I want to talk about what I'm calling the ideology of Brexit, which I'm mainly talking about it on the right here. I think it is fair to mention that there is sort of a logic that can justify Brexit, I would say, I know my audience, on the left, but the sort of Faragian and the right populist one is the more prominent of the two, the more impactful. So that's like this anti-immigrant rhetoric, and also rhetoric that is really not trusting of Europe. And I'd say that, of course, one of the ways we see this for students is that the tough government action on student visas come into effect under the Sunak Conservatives. It's quite a shocking news story for me at the time, I'd say, even though it doesn't really affect me, but it meant that international students could no longer bring their family members. But what this really shows is that there is this sort of mistrust, but also for students, it's almost like they're a special threat of some kind. I know you see it in people talking about wokeness on university campuses, but also this, you know, it's like students are some sort of special backdoor for people to become and get in here in ways that are deemed as less than legal. And the sort of rhetoric is going to affect all international students, and also some of our home students, really, depending on factors such as ethnicity. I mean, there's one, and also academics as well, international academics and British academics with different ethnic backgrounds. And there's one example that I remember being told about while I was at UCL of a Spanish academic in, I believe it was a Tesco, being told, essentially, that you're unwanted here and to leave, more or less, and that be Brexit. And also on campus, we're seeing Tory societies becoming more unhinged. The UCL Tory Society has been banned a couple of times because of stuff that they have said. And also Reform UK societies, such as this one at Lancaster. And that these are sorts of things, this rhetoric that is getting onto our campuses, is something that really, I'd say, makes the UK a less appealing option for study and work. But also, fundamentally, this is going to impact UK students as well, indirectly, if not directly. International students are a key source of funding for our universities. Even when EU students pay home fees, it's still having students there is important, and EU students coming here is a good way to bulk up those numbers. Plus, we've seen declines in overall international students, fueled by the drop in EU students, but actually even non-EU numbers are declining, and that is going to be part of why our universities are having the difficulties that they are. There's also a cultural loss here for students, and this is what I meant when I was talking about sort of this mobility of ideas, is that there's less chance for these cultural exchange, for these different experiences. And my department, the UCLC, the School of Slavonic and East European Studies, this is really something that could bleed into damage for our wider studies. Being an area studies department and applying interdisciplinary techniques to a region of Europe, Central and Eastern Europe, many of whom are member nations of the EU, we could end up with less students and academics from this region who are sort of essential to our understanding of it. And also, we're missing out really on potential talent from abroad because we're failing to attract it. If anything, we're saying, we don't want you. And now, talking to the further damage to students and the sort of rhetoric of we don't want you, is this story. I found this at basically the last minute preparing my presentation, but I thought it was so shocking such a shocking article in the South West Londoner. I thought it was worth including this sort of extract from it. This is about Anya, who was 23 and born to a British mother, though never lived in the UK, so she was a British national. However, because of the changes in the fee structure caused by Brexit, she would have to pay international fees. And essentially, Brits abroad are almost being treated as if they're not really British, and that they're unwelcome, and that essentially this is the government who have either overlooked these students, or perhaps worse, you could argue maybe they've been deliberately left behind. And this young lady, Anya, she said that she had intended on applying to UK graduate schools, but the long-lasting effects of Brexit essentially meant that no. As she said, it's sort of bonkers to me that a vote that was held when I was 15, a referendum, an advisory referendum, has changed the scope of my life. I mean, you know, I was 11 I think, when the Brexit referendum happened, and I echo those sorts of sentiments now speaking here today. Now to move on to really the final point here, the economic consequences of Brexit. These are sort of things that we're all feeling, but students in particular will also be feeling it. I mean, it's worth saying that Brexit is not a sort of shock in the economic sense. It's not a short-term shock that the market's going to adjust for. This is a structural issue with our economy. And also, one thing for students is that sort of the two main expenses for the average student are your rent and your food bills. I commute into London. My expenses structure is slightly different, but that's not the average student experience. For me, it's travel, which I mean is going up as well. And I mean, it is food, but it's less groceries, more takeouts and street food and that. But again, those prices are soaring up because of Brexit. Because LSE analysis found that food prices rose by 25 percentage points between December 2019 and March 2023. And that this would have been 8 points lower, or 8 points less of an increase, which amounts to food prices being 30% lower than they are today, if Brexit did not happen. What this means is that for students, when food is, your main expense, you really had quite a massive increase in that, considering the fact that wages are stagnant if you're doing a part-time job, and the fact that maintenance loans are falling short of living costs and not increasing with inflation, you're not able to meet. And what does this mean for students? This means that students are, 18% of students are using food banks, which is, I'd say, quite a high number. And also that 22% often skipped meals to save money. Now, the thing is, you're studying, you need food to keep your brain sort of active. If you're doing physical activity alongside your studies, if you're part of society, you need that energy. And yet, people are having to skip meals because of it. It's worth noting here that when I was in school, the sort of figure we were given for how much a student has to spend on their weekly groceries is about £25. So, if you think you've still got that sort of £25 to play with each week, but these food prices are astronomically higher than they should be if we had made the right decision and not left the EU, you can see how we end up in this situation. And the figure that I've not included on these slides is the fact that if you include the ones who only sometimes skip meals to save money, on top of the often, that comes out to the majority of students in the UK skipping meals either occasionally or often, which I think is quite a shocking and disturbing factor, and I'm lucky that I'm not in that statistic. And so what does this mean to the sort of overall theme that I talked about at the beginning, the loss of mobility? We've obviously seen the barriers to crossing borders and the visas, the residence permits, and the Turing funding as well makes it harder to front those costs because of how it is structured in a way that is not as fit for purpose as the Erasmus scheme was. We're also seeing that if we are taking away the incentive to study here for students from abroad, even to some of our students here with our different ethnic backgrounds perhaps, that we're creating barriers to exposure to new ideas, something that university should be a key ground to do. We're also seeing barriers to social mobility because of opportunities that we cannot pursue because of Brexit, barriers to day-to-day life, such as eating 3 square meals a day, and likely more, because I'd like to repeat, this is not an exhaustive presentation. And I now want to sort of conclude on my sort of final note here. And the final note is that fundamentally, young people didn't vote for this, and yet it is our futures who have been damaged by the post-Brexit arrangements. And hopefully we're going to grow old and we're not going to experience the death of the universe in our lifetime, so this is only going to be getting worse as long as Brexit and us being not within the EU continues. And I want to sort of show that young people have been against this sort of from the start. My generation, First News, a sort of newspaper targeted at young people, I remember this poll quite distinctly when I was 11 years old, because I was sort of a young kid interested in politics, so this was a big deal, that of 7,000 First News readers, or politically engaged sort of children, around 7 in 10 said that they wanted to remain in the EU at the time. In the actual referendum itself, about 73 of those aged 18 to 24 voted to remain. Of course, one of the issues was that there was lower turnout. That was something to be addressed in a question session after this. But within this generation that was polled by First News, there's been a consistency. 75% of those aged 18 to 24 in 2025 thought the UK was wrong to leave the EU. that sentiment has not changed. We thought it was a bad idea when we were children, we think it's a bad idea as adults, but also that in the 1824 age group, both in the referendum and post-Brexit, we still think that this is a bad idea. I know that one thing that many people who voted Brexit said was that they thought this was somehow going to be the best thing for the future generations. And I'd say fundamentally that it was not, and that we need to do something about this. Thank you.